So last week we talked about the literary prologue to Luke, and that could sound incredibly boring, except it's not. Because Luke is giving us this whole picture of why he wrote the thing and why it matters and what it means and who it's for and where you fit. And rather than just making you guess, because sometimes religious people like to do that, he just lays it all out there for you. But the prologue I mentioned last time around is made up of two parts. You've got the part that tells you about the thesis and the point of the book, but then you've got the prologue that is the backstory and the birth narrative of the main character. The prologue has the story of Jesus and his unusual birth, but it also includes the story of his cousin John the Baptist and the unusual circumstances surrounding his birth. All of this mysterious, miraculous stuff is set up for where the story is going to go next. So we're going to hit more of the setup right now in Luke chapter 1, verses 5 through 25. In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah, and his wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were upright in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commandments and regulations blamelessly. There are three characters introduced in these two verses who I want to talk about. One is Herod, and by talk about, I mean I'm going to do a bonus video because it's a confusing name and he's part of a bigger family, so check out the bonus video on Herod. That'll all make sense. The main characters here are going to be Zechariah and Elizabeth. This older couple, they're both born into a priestly lineage. Being a priest or someone who was a go-between between people and God wasn't just something you signed up for one day in this culture. It was something that was a familial obligation. And so from the get-go, these are people who've occupied a unique role in society in nurturing people's relationship with God. They're not Christians because there's no Jesus yet, so that isn't really a thing. But they're sincere believers in God who want to get it right and try to live their lives the right way. So it seems like things are pretty good for these people. They're married and they're happy, but the kids thing hasn't been addressed, and that was a big deal at this time. Well, it comes up in verse 7. It says, "But they had no children because Elizabeth was barren, and they were both well along in years." This is a lot worse than it sounds. Now, I know there are people watching who have struggled to have kids, and those of us who didn't really struggle with that and kids just kind of happened and it was weird, we don't really get what you're going through, but only a small percentage of people in our society really will resonate with the pain that these people felt. But even more so because of the era in which they lived, this would have been a deep pain. Welfare at this point in the history of the world came from having kids who could take care of you when you got older. This guy's close to retirement, so they're looking at some financial difficulties probably coming down the road. They're also looking at the reality that their lineage dies with them. This was more of a cultural embarrassment and burden for a woman than it is now, and Elizabeth would have had to have lived with this for her whole life and eventually just accepted the reality that this is part of my story. I don't get to be a part of what all of my peers and friends have got to experience. So the stage is set, we know the characters, we know their circumstances. Let's find out what happens in this particular incident, starting in verse 8. "Once when Zechariah's division was on duty, he was serving as a priest before God." Verse 9. "He was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense." Verse 10. "And when the time for the burning of incense came, all the assembled worshipers were praying outside." This is like the Olympics. This is your big day. You get one crack at this thing. Many of these priests really literally only did this once in their entire career. So finally it falls to Zechariah. This is the pinnacle of a career. And here's what you don't want to do in that situation. You don't want to poop the bed. You want to put the things in the right places and burn the incense the right way and honor God and have everybody feel really good about the ceremony. Verse 11, "Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense." Verse 12, "When Zechariah saw him, he was startled and was gripped with fear." Now, on the one hand, I get why he would be terrified, because you just don't run into celestial beings that often, and when you do, it can cause discomfort, I imagine. On the other hand, if something like this was going to happen, it would make sense that it would happen in the place that everyone understood God to live as he dealt with the Jewish people. I mean, this is where God hangs out. We find out why the angel showed up in verse 13. "But the angel said to him, 'Don't be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you're to give him the name John. He'll be a joy and a delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth, for he'll be great in the sight of the Lord. He's never to take any wine or other fermented drink, and he'll be filled with the Holy Spirit even from birth. Many of the people of Israel will he bring back to the Lord their God. And he'll go on before the Lord in the spirit of the power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." Now, I could break this speech down into every tiny little theological detail, but I think we'll get more bang for the buck by just thinking about the big picture of what Zechariah is saying instead of getting lost in that kind of language, which sometimes can be overwhelming. First, He's saying God is going to do something really significant and redemptive through your son. Now, a priest would know what this means right off the bat. In fact, most people in this era in Judea would know right off the bat what this means. It sounds a lot like the Messiah, this promised character who was supposed to come along and bring redemption and restoration to the broken people, even the broken state of Israel. At this point in history, almost everybody assumed that that was going to come in the form of a political leader or a William Wallace type revolutionary who would overthrow the Roman occupation and restore Jewish autonomy and the Jewish state that had been beat down about 100 years before this is all going on. But what this angel, who we'll find out is Gabriel in a minute, seems to be saying is that the role that Zechariah's son John is going to play in paving the way for what God is doing next is bigger than something just political or military. People will turn to God, he'll prepare the way for the Lord, and a bunch of blessings from God are going to come through him. That's a lot to take in. Obvious question, what is Zechariah going to say about this? Verse 18. Zechariah asked the angel, "How can I be sure of this? I'm an old man and my wife is well along in years." It's really tempting at this point to get on my self-righteous, super smart 2016 I know everything in retrospect horse and just beat this guy up for not being faithful enough. But I get where he's coming from. I mean, he's not an idiot. He knows where babies come from. He understands that biology isn't exactly lining up with these promises, and it's hard for him to picture. So rather than leading with enthusiasm and excitement about how it's going to work out, he leads with skepticism and a desire for proof. The angel isn't super impressed. In verse 19, the angel answered, "I'm Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I've been sent to speak to you and tell you this good news. And now you'll be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you didn't believe my words, which will come true at their proper time." So again, the question that Zechariah asked is, how can I be sure of this? And the answer that the angel gives is, I'm Gabriel, dude. You've heard of me. I'm kind of come up from time to time. I'm significant. I represent the God of all creation and all things who you worship for a living. His point is, me showing up should be enough for you to know that this is legit. But since you're into signs and magic to prove that it's all true, cool, here's a sign for you. You just won't be able to talk no matter how much you want to until this thing is done. And what's implicit in this negative or reverse miracle is that you have a guy who talks about God for a living who now can't talk about God. And because he wasn't in a place to use his mouth to talk about God, to express belief, and to point toward what God was going to do through his son who would come around in about 9 months, he instead is going to be a testimony to what God is doing through his silence. Gabriel bottom lined it by saying, you can believe, not believe, talk, not talk, whatever, one way or another, God is going to use your future son to point the way to the Lord and do all these blessings and things that I'm talking about. At the appointed time, it's going to happen. We check in back outside with the people who were waiting in verse 21. Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering why he stayed so long in the temple. Have you ever been in a ceremony, like a wedding or a funeral, and something goes wrong, like a weird aunt or uncle gets up and says strange things, and everyone feels vicarious embarrassment and nobody really knows what to do? I sense that's what's happening here. You've got a guy at the end of his career, everybody's rooting for him, he's endeared himself, and clearly he screwed something up or he would be out by now. They connect the dots pretty quickly in verse 22. So when he came out, he couldn't speak to them. They realized he'd seen a vision in the temple, for he kept making signs to them but remained unable to speak. They probably don't know what this was about. We don't see that he's able to really communicate exactly what happened, but at least it would seem there's a good excuse for whatever took so long, and he's going to go home and reconnect with his wife. When his time of service was completed, he returned home. After this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant and for 5 months remained in seclusion. "The Lord has done this for me," she said. "In these days he has shown his favor and taken away my disgrace among the people." So Zechariah goes home and they conceive a child together. Presumably he still isn't talking or explaining any of this, but we discover later that he's writing stuff down, so people must have figured out more of what's going on. Elizabeth isn't completely in the dark, and she's certainly in the loop enough to know that what's happening here is a gift from God, and that God has not just shown her a solid to give her a random kid so she wouldn't be barren and childless forever, but that God is doing something special out of this pregnancy and out of the child that's going to come out of it. And now here are 3 observations about all of this in 1 measly minute. First, it's not just that Zechariah is being punished by being made silent. It's a testimony to the glory of God. And it's also an opportunity for him to do something that people who talk about God a lot don't often do well, which is just shut up and appreciate that God is God. Second, as we get further into this prologue, it raises the question, why do we even need a prologue? It's to urge people away from conceiving of the coming Messiah as a vengeance military Messiah and to get them thinking in spiritually redemptive terms. Second, it's going to come with a call to repentance, simply to get people's hearts right with the God who made. Third, it's a call away from forgetfulness and to remember that religion never was the point, but the point was that God was to be connected with his people and the larger world through his redemptive work. Final observation, all of Luke is designed to tell a story while also implicitly saying, look, this is a big deal and you fit in here somewhere too. So we're 3 episodes now into this series on Luke. We're still going as well with our series on Acts. But this Luke thing, I know a lot of you have jumped in later in the game with Acts, and this gives you a chance to be with this whole book from the beginning, watching it unfold somewhat in real time. And I think that's a really cool way to encounter this. So if you have other people who you think would enjoy the process as well, I would be greatly honored if you would put it in front of them. The subscription thing helps you stay up to date and helps me stay motivated and excited. So if you haven't subscribed yet and you think I've earned it, I'd be really grateful if you would do that. We have so much more to talk about. Keep an eye out for those bonus episodes explaining some of the side details of characters like John the Baptist, Luke, and Herod the Great. And in the meantime, I'm Matt Whitman, and this is the 10-Minute Bible Hour, and I'll catch you soon.